de privatización, del fondo de inversión.
Del fondo de inversión.
Please take your seats. And I have a request, if you'll kindly turn off your iPhones and any other electronics, not to disturb the discussion. I'm going to call on General Al Gray, the chairman of the International Board, if I may, the Board of Regents of the Potomac, to make some remarks.
I got my phone off.
Okay, that's good.
Well, welcome again to another one of our, hopefully, I'm sure will be very interesting seminars. And I won't say much you all really know about what we try to do here at Potomac Institute. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan group of people, and we try to do good studies and work for the government, for the research community, for Congress, and so on. The recent pivot or rebalancing to the Pacific, as it's now known, of course, has caused a lot of concern about the Pacific region. What are we going to do there? What about the rest of the world? And I mention that because indeed, it's not just the Mideast, but Africa, Latin America, other parts of the world, other regions, if you will, are crucial to the thinking for the future. I say that because we all know about globalization. We all know what the globalization economic situation is. We all know the impact. And it follows, therefore, that anything you do in the Pacific has an impact in Africa. It has an impact in Latin America. It has an impact in the Mideast. It has an impact in Europe. In other words, there are no more regional-only strategic thought processes, in my opinion, that are valid. You've got to think globally, no matter what you do. Looking at Latin America is not new for the Potomac Institute or for Dr. Alexander, as many of you know. As far back as 1984, we were looking at terrorists and terrorist activities, including narco-terrorism and the like in Latin America. In fact, I think, Yona, you can show, you published a book, did you not, around 1984 or something like that? But at any rate, we've been long concerned about that. And of course, if you go back even years before that, when there were many dictatorial type governments in Latin America and very little in democracy, very few democratic movements. And the United States led that movement internationally to bring democracy to Latin America. And there was a concerted effort for many of the years that I was relatively senior in government with the Marine Corps. And so we saw that all the time. I remember in 1988, one of the many times I got in trouble while I was in the Marines, but the Department of Defense policy was not to be involved in counter-narcotics and narco-terrorism, because that was other people's responsibilities, and it wasn't that they didn't want to help, but they didn't want to spend the money to do it. And I had a very good friend of mine who was a naval officer who happened to be the commandant of the Colombian Marines. And I also knew the ambassador down there and the like. And so I went ahead and bought some boats and we trained up some Marines. And I sent them down there for a year to help patrol the Amazon. And they patrolled 1,400 or 1,500 kilometers and the like. They on the way, they repaired a lot of the Colombian Marine weapons and things like that, and they worked together on the counterterrorism, counter-narcotic issue even then. And it's these kinds of relationships, these kinds of friendships, which are crucial as we go forward in the future. Nobody really ever said anything about it. They didn't like it. They grumbled a little bit, but they got over it. And we did some good work down there. I recall, as a matter of interest, the ambassador said that you have to come down to Colombia unarmed. Yeah. And I said, Marines don't go anywhere unarmed. And he said, no, the Colombian rules are that you'll come unarmed. And I said, my rules are we go nowhere unarmed, because after all, this was after the Moscow incident, this was after the Beirut bombing. Wouldn't it look nice if a few Marines were down in Colombia unarmed and got hurt? And so finally I said, no weapons, no Marines. And so they decided, well, okay. So the Marines went down armed, and everything worked out fine. These are the kind of policy things things that one has to be very careful of when we think about the future. We seem to be, as a government, Joe Good Guy. We want to talk about everything and plan everything and take months to make certain kind of decisions, which could be done in the morning. It used to be done in the morning when there were no PowerPoints and things like that. But at any rate, so anyway, welcome. I won't take any more time here, but thank you all for coming. And Yoni, you got it.
Okay, thank you, General. You know, it's always very tough to follow the General. Take your whiskey. Okay, thank you very kindly. Since I'm short, I'm going to be short because we have a outstanding, extraordinary panel. I welcome all of you to our session today on Latin America. Before we continue, I want to make sure that we recognize a group of people who are going to be the future scholars and professionals. Right here, we have some of them. Would you stand up and, I don't know where Woody is, right here. Would you introduce them very quickly?
Certainly.
No speeches.
I'll be short. These are a group of interns who worked very hard to get this program together. They come from as far away as Oregon and California. We also have a number of international students, including one from Paris, France. They've done great. They helped me get my work done. Without them, this event wouldn't be together today. So I'd like to thank them for their work.
This group would have to deal with these challenges the next 50, 100 years. I'm going to introduce the panel very, very shortly, but before I do, the question really is why is it that we're focusing attention on Latin America, as the General indicated? We are not starting from the first base. We dealt with this issue going back to the Cold War, Dirty War, the insurgencies in Central America, and the interregional links with Libya, for example, Castro activities in Angola and elsewhere. So the point I'm making is that it is very critical for us to deal with this issue of Latin America today. And there are four specific reasons or rationales, if you will, to all this event today. Number one, of course, the death of Chavez, and the big question is of succession in terms of the person who is going to lead Venezuela. Secondly, the legacy or the idea, continuity of the Venezuelan policy against poverty, imperialism, the U.S., and so on. And whether other leftist governments in Latin America that are going to support, continue that policy or change it. And finally, the external, I think, links with Iran and terrorist groups around the world. So this is number one. Number two, I think we have to recognize, of course, the election of the new Pope, Pope Francis, to be the head of the Catholic Church. Recognition, I think, of its growing significance in Latin America and the church future in the world. That's the second reason why it is timely. And thirdly, I think we have to look at the intensification of the links between organized crime and criminality in Latin America, narco trafficking, human trafficking, and so on, and also other regions such as West Africa and the North African countries and the Sahel and so on. We are following this very closely, and in fact we just published one report which we can make available to you on North Africa and the implications. It was published last month, so we can have a copy for you. So in other words, we're looking not only at the regional, but the interregional. And finally, one additional reason that this is the 21st anniversary, actually March 17, in the attack 1992, the attack on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. This was the first reach of Hezbollah and Iran. And then there was a subsequent attack on the AMIA, on the Jewish Cultural Society in Buenos Aires. I had the opportunity as an academic to provide academic support to those who investigated that specific attacks. And I can tell you that because the conclusions were very, very clear by the government of Argentina, for example, of the implication, the involvement of Iran and Hezbollah in this case. Just recently, the government of Argentina decided to work together with Iran to open up that particular investigation. And the question is, what are really the implications for international cooperation in combating terrorism? So what I'm really saying is, if you wish, you can find many reasons why we should focus our attention also on Latin America, not only on the Middle East, not only on Asia, on the Pacific, and Africa. I would like to introduce our panel. Our first really speaker who is going to provide a context, a brief context to our discussion today, is Ambassador Roger Noriega. As you know, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and he was also the ambassador to the OAS. You have actually the bios of each speaker, so I'm not going to go into great detail, except to indicate that for many, many years, he provided great leadership in this area with many, many countries in Latin America. Also, I may note Canada as well. And I recall also his work in Congress, going all the way back to deal with the House International Relations Committee staff and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff. And I asked him to speak on anything he thinks is useful, but particularly one of the questions relates to the succession after Chavez, and secondly, the narco links and the impact on the security concerns of the United States and the international community. Ambassador Noriega, please. No, it's whatever is better for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the introduction. Everybody knows, of course, that Hugo Chavez died last week. I think it was April 5th or 4th. And even that's a matter for debate. But in this post-Chavez era, there is a struggle underway right now on whether a regime that is really a narco-state and the best friend of Hezbollah and Iran in this hemisphere might be replaced by a friendly democratic neighbor, the likes of which Venezuela was before Hugo Chavez. It's likely that in these April 14th elections, the Chavista regime will hold on to power, in my view. But that succession is not stable in the short run and not sustainable in the long run, and I'll talk about why. But a lot of this has to do with the fundamentals being shaken, the foundations being shaken in Venezuela under that ruling Chavista regime. There's an impending socioeconomic meltdown, rampant street crime, a faltering oil sector, bitter infighting within the Chavista movement, complicity with drug trafficking and terrorism that really casts a serious doubt on the legitimacy of any such regime, and the inept performance of Nicolás Maduro, the designated successor, as well as a growing rejection of Cuba's really heavy-handed role in the succession and the corrupt institutions and rigged electoral process that will help the Chavistas hold on to power. Beset by all of these challenges, I think, and with Chavez no longer at the top of the ballot, they're going to have to pull out all the stops to hold on to power and engineer a victory on April 14th, which I expect they will. A little bit about these economic challenges in greater detail. There was a currency evaluation in February, which was really too little too late to break the fall of the Venezuelan economy that has been decimated for 14 years by gross mismanagement, staggering corruption, and policies that were really consciously meant to strangle the private sector. The Chavista economic team is scrambling now to stabilize that economy in advance of the April 14th elections, but their incompetence, really their ideological disorientation, is evident as they ratchet up restrictions that will stifle production and commerce. I had thought maybe that they would adopt in the post-Chavez period some sort of tactical moderation, both politically and economically, but that does not seem to be the case. There does not seem to be any sort of subtle pivoting in either the economic policies or political trajectory or the rhetoric of the regime. You see inflation, food shortages, power outages, a crumbling infrastructure, which is taking a terrible toll more and more on all Venezuelans across the board. And we suspect that this devaluation will hit the working class, the lower class, more impoverished sector of that economy just about the time these elections are taking place. There will be no windfall of oil revenues because production is greatly diminished and really oversubscribed. Actual production of Venezuela of oil, contrary to what their official numbers is, about 2.4 million barrels a day. That's far below the peak of 3.3 million barrels a day before Chavez. And sweetheart deals with China and Russia and Iran and giveaways to Cuba and the other client states in the Caribbean and Central America are bleeding Venezuela dry. There simply is no more oil to sell at this point. There will also be no China bailout. And what do I mean by that? In the 18 months leading up to the elections where Chavez won a term which he never actually began, the Chinese loaned about $28 billion to Chavez, which was used in campaign election year spending right before those elections. But Beijing has closed the checkbook. A couple of months ago, they summoned Elias Hawa, who's one of Chavez's inner circle people, to Beijing. He thought he could cajole them into giving them more money leading into this election, and they said no, I'm afraid not, because there's no production, and they had serious doubts about the legitimacy of the regime and whether they would ever be paid back by a successor government. Frankly, Chavez came into office politicizing PDVSA, the state-run petroleum company, and he used its revenue as his petty cash fund. And now the company is ruined and the till is run dry. It's filled with IOUs. Talk a little bit about the political infighting that's shaking the base of Chavismo. And reflect on the fact that, as I describe this, that reflect on the state of Chavismo, that we're talking about infighting that pits a wing that's loyal to Havana, a failed government of Cuba, hardly a legitimate one, against a wing that is loyal to the narco military. So the failed foreign ideological hard left, loyal to Havana, and those who see government as an opportunity to make more money and be complicit in drug trafficking. Maduro, as I mentioned, the acting president, de facto president, and Elias Hawa, who's now foreign minister, are those who sort of carry the Cuban flag in this whole process, and the Cubans seem to be winning. And we see sort of overdone rhetoric and radicalization being employed by Maduro now that really has Cuba's fingerprints all over it. Very anti-American, very rabid, very radical. Diosdado Cabello is the president of the National Assembly. He sort of leads the other wing. He's mostly interested in maintaining the impunity that is required to be a narco state. And he has doubts whether Maduro can hold on to power in the long run, and he doesn't want to put his life and his fortune, tens of billions of dollars, in the hands of these ideologues managed from Cuba. And there's a measure of nationalism mixed in here within the Venezuelan military that rejects this interference of the Cubans. So far, Cabello seems to be closing ranks with Maduro. He could have challenged Maduro's legitimacy under Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution. He has, as President of the National Assembly, should have assumed the presidency. But Maduro moved more quickly and brazenly, and he claimed that job. Cabello has gone along with that in the short run. He's closed ranks for now. But if the election begins to look shaky, it is a possibility that the military, which has a big role in running those elections, may decide that it doesn't want to steal that election for Havana's people and for people that they have doubts about. And on these elections, certainly Chavismo has a distinct institutional advantage. They have, of course, some residual popularity because Chavez was a popular figure to a considerable extent, particularly among the very poor. And they have this great institutional unfair advantage and access of the media. Virtually most of the independent media silenced. The president with access to the so-called cadenas, where he can insist that every network in the country carry his speeches, which could go on for long periods of time. And the opposition, which has much fewer resources to buy the kind of advertising and access to the media that they would need to get their message out. The question is, will the state have the resources to motivate and mobilize the voters? To motivate them, that is to say, with giveaway programs, a lot of cash on the street, and mobilizing, literally getting them to the polls. They have a very sophisticated mechanism that few people know about. That when you enter a voting place, you put your thumbprint down. That thumbprint registers your name, and the Chavista electoral command knows immediately that you voted. So consequently, around midday, they know who has not voted, and they have the cell numbers and the addresses of everybody that has not voted, whose vote they count on, and they literally go down and pick them up one at a time. So you have satellite imagery of every street, and they have the routes of trucks and buses will drive to get their vote out. Now that's, frankly, the DNC and the RNC would love to have that system, but only one side has that system in Venezuela today. And that's not fair. So as long as that continues, they'll probably, that's their important advantage. But there are disadvantages too. First, Maduro is not Chavez, and Maduro is Maduro. That's another disadvantage. He's not Chavez. If you can Google roguish charm, and you'll find hits for roguish charm. And Chavez is a charming rogue. Maduro is not. He may be a rogue, but he's not particularly charming, so there's the charisma deficit. Chavez was able to modulate because he was a strong figure in his own right. Maduro is not. He seems to be following this Cuban script, which is very, very radical, very polarizing, very shrill. It comes off, nevertheless, as a clumsy, pale imitation of Chavez. And then also these unpopular economic policies are going to begin to bite, and they won't have the resources to mobilize their voters. Capriles, on the other hand, he's being much more aggressive than he was against Chavez because, again, Maduro is not Chavez. He also has nothing to lose. He has invigorated his base with this tougher rhetoric, and also those near-me's, neither this person nor that person, who have sat out, that's roughly 2.5 million voters who have sat out every election in the last decade, may see this as their last chance, and they may be even further mobilized or motivated by Maduro's shrill rhetoric. Also, I can assure you, none of these people have been sitting around for 10 years waiting for an opportunity to vote for Nicolás Maduro. And they never came out to vote for Chavez or his opponent, but it's very likely that they won't come out. Those that do come out now will be Capriles or opposition voters. So if there's an obvious fraud to hold on to power, that will delegitimize that regime, if there's somebody around to talk about it. But the United States' official position in this election, and remember how I described it, between the possibility of electing a government that would lead back to the friendly, positive, constructive relationships of a prosperous country with the United States, or an enemy of the United States, the best friend of Iran and Hezbollah and narco-terrorists. The official position of the United States State Department is neutrality. Neutrality. Which suggests that they're either insulting our intelligence or revealing their own lack of it. What should be on the table with the successor regime? Democracy and human rights. Obviously, the State Department does not care about that, and neither will a Chavista successor, of course. But drugs, the fact that you have a narco state in Venezuela today, and will if Chavez's designated successor wins the election. And what I mean by that, Diosdado Cabello, the President of the National Assembly, the former head of the Army, the former Minister of Defense, the current Vice Minister of Interior, all implicated in narco-trafficking. In the last 7 years, acquiring tens of billions of dollars from that trade, which they don't want to give up. We need to have that on the table. Also, the fact that today Venezuela is one of Iran's best friends in the world, serving as a way to cut around international sanctions and providing safe haven to Hezbollah in their territory, and really a partnership with Hezbollah. And I'll stop on this, I think, dramatic note. The number 2 person of the Venezuelan embassy in Damascus today is a man named Ghassia Tefnes Ardin Abu Ali, Venezuelan. Venezuelan, it's not a very common Venezuelan last name. Well, there's a reason for that. He was born in Lebanon. And he's essentially Hezbollah's envoy to the Venezuelan government. And he's like this with Nicolás Maduro, the new president of Venezuela. He is on the U.S. Treasury's list of persons providing logistical and material support to Hezbollah. And that's the kind of regime that we're talking about. Those are the stakes that are at play today in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And in fact, what you said about the narco trafficking and the role of Hezbollah is something we have to look very seriously. And in fact, on April the 4th, we're going to have an event right here on the Hezbollah, and now to combat Hezbollah. As I mentioned before, there is a long link in history. Not only that, Latin American, of course, call them freedom fighters, or call them insurgents, or commandos, or terrorists. They were trained in Lebanon, and some of them I had the opportunity to interview at the time, going all the way back. At any rate, we're going to have the panel look at different perspectives. Our next speaker is Professor Monica Arruda de Almeida, and you have information about her background. I know of her work all the way when she was teaching at UCLA at the time, and my colleagues are there, but particularly I tried to follow her work related to the anti-money laundering effort, and also looking at the political economy perspective. And since she can provide a Brazilian perspective, you can talk about anything from politics to football or soccer.
Okay.
Okay? So,
Thank you.
but you have 10 minutes.
Okay, I have you.
Yeah, you know that. Okay.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure being here. I would like to thank Professor Iona Alexander for the invitation. It's an honor to be able to participate at this debate. And my take on the legacy of Chavez is going to be a very different perspective than the one presented by the ambassador. I think I'm going to speak as somebody who works on issues of economic development and who happens to be Brazilian, and also we're still in Latin America, although sometimes Brazilians don't think of themselves as being Latin Americans. But I would say that the pundits, at least in Brazil, have a much more forgiving view of Chavez. in the sense of, but it's a more forgiving, more understanding, but also one of missed opportunities. And Chavez really didn't come out of the blue. You know, there was a real demand for leaders that would put more focus on issues of social justice and really deal with centuries-long problem that the region has in terms of income inequality. We have years of in the mid-1980s and 1990s of economic reform that was a departure from the state-controlled economic policies of the importance of institutional industrialization. And despite the initial successes of the pro-market economic reforms in the 80s and 90s, which really were fundamental to deal with the question of stabilization of the economies. You know, as many of you may remember, we were dealing with hyperinflation, you know, like 3-4 digits of inflation for years. My whole experience of being Latin American was one of living with hyperinflation. And the minute that I left Brazil in '94 to live here, they finally dealt with inflation there. You know, so my whole life, was dealing with inflation, and so it was Latin America is a very unjust region. You know, the opportunities for economic upgrade are limited, are still limited, and there was this real claim for government policies that would address the issue of inequality and social justice. I would argue that the pro-market reforms, they did a great deal in addressing those issues just by dealing with hyperinflation, which is a major source of poverty and inequality. But, you know, after so many decades and even centuries of the legacy of inequality, there was a claim for a greater state intervention because pro-market reforms were not being successful in addressing those reforms. And so there you have the so-called left turn in Latin America, you know, that really, which pretty much were governments that replaced the other leaders that were very successful implementing economic reforms, but still there was, you know, now you're doing very well dealing with macroeconomic stabilization, but so what? We still have like a terrible educational system and not poor access to health, have very little social mobility. So there was really a claim, a need to have people in power that would address those issues. And Hugo Chavez was like the first one of the leaders that came afterwards in the region that tried to address, that had this goal of dealing with these big social issues, right? And what I can say in terms of the experience, have a comparison between the Brazilian experience especially of the Lula administration and that of Chavez is, if you look at the two performances, I look at the Chavez case as one of really, as I said in the beginning, of missed opportunities, because he did have his administration, his government, really attempt to address this demand for social justice, but it unfortunately was through manners that was the ways that were very politicized. And one case that I'm going to address is the so-called conditional cash transfers. And I think it's good to establish a comparison to the social policies that were developed in Brazil to those that were developed in Venezuela. As just like for those of you who are not familiar with the public policy in Brazil, the cash transfers started during the Fernando Henrique Cardoso administration, which is the administration right before Lula, and it demonstrated some success. And by the time that Lula came to power, once he stabilized the economy, dealing with macroeconomic issues, diminishing the country's reliance on foreign debt, they really, the whole first term of the Lula administration was to do the homework, really, on macroeconomic fundamentals. They diminished the exposure of Brazil to foreign markets, and once he was able to put the Brazil in a much stronger economic and financial situation, the second term was really when he dedicated his focus. He put a greater focus on the cash transfers programs, and one thing that you learn about the Brazilian program that was really inspired by efficiency. And one wouldn't, those of us who study political science, we know that historically ministries that are have the mandate of dealing with social spending, they are really target for a lot of clientelism, for a lot of embezzlement, and apparently that wasn't the case with the ministry that was created by the Lula administration to deal with cash transfers program. You know, talking with people who work for the administration, they said that there was a real concern by Lula himself to insulate the ministry responsible for the program from political use, right? And just hire the best that they could, the people available to implement the program. And that's why the program has been claimed as being a model that could be reproduced in many places, including in Africa, because it has been very successful, one that reduces the intermediation as much as possible from political use. So people who are benefited by this program, they just go to the ATM machines, get their payments directly from the ATM machine with no interference by a mayor or state governor, and there is so much that you can use politically. It doesn't mean that Lula himself didn't get the benefit from that for the implementation of the program. There are scholarly papers that have demonstrated that he really benefited politically in terms of the electoral results from the program, but that you can interpret that as a politician actually doing what he had promised to his constituency beforehand, right there. So there is some debate whether it's was used for purely electoral uses or not, but this is a debate that goes on in classrooms until today. But I tend not to be so cynical about it, So it's just like somebody who delivered what had promised, and he was able to gain politically from it. And if you look at what happened during the Chavez government. He openly said that it was the misiones, the cash transfer programs were used to help the poor, but also clearly had this electoral goal, immediate electoral goal of of keeping him and his government in power, and that's like what I see as a missed opportunity, because it's a program that can the conditional cash transfers are they really can play a major role in alleviating poverty and social injustice in the region, and in the case of the Venezuela, the reasons why he politicized are there's a lot of room for debate. Some would argue that he wouldn't have the political environment to implement, to make it more an institutional program in the way that the Lula administration was able to do, because some say that in Venezuela the political environment was much more polarized. There was much more rejection, and especially from people from the central bank to use the funds from the PDVSA to social transfers. So whatever reason was, the fact is that his government controlled a lot of the resources of PDVSA, coming from the PDVSA, to invest in social programs, and it was very opaque. They lacked transparency. And if you talk about legacy of Chavez, his dad, and so how there's how one wonders how the Misiones are going to survive now that he's not around anymore. Lula left government, and the Bolsa Familia, which is the conditional cash transfers in Brazil, are still on, strong, and no matter who comes to power, the institutions are there, and they, and they can survive regardless of who is in power. If they come another government from the opposition, if they decided to diminish the program, reduce the program, that's another thing. But institutionally, it's very well set. And that's, unfortunately, is not the case with Venezuela. It was really used very politically and used personalistically, and that's really a missed opportunity. But we can't think of even Chavez, as Ambassador had highlighted, was a terrible administrator. It was very so it in a way it fits in with the big picture of how poorly he managed the country. And but he was a political figure that addressed the needs of the population at the time, and he didn't come out of a vacuum, and that's the history of Latin America. If you may expect other left-leaning governments in power if there is this perception that whoever is in power is not are really addressing the major problem of the region, that's still a very unjust region with a lot of social inequality. So that's pretty much, I think, how Brazilians would see the Chavez movement. The people talk a lot about Chavismo and whether it's going to be follow the Peronism that survived Peron, or whether it was going to be a one shot, that Chavismo is not going to be able to survive afterwards. So there's this element of suspense there, but there's no suspense is that really the Misiones have failed when it comes to being a medium of social work, social service, and cash transfers that could help the society, especially the poor who are really the ones that supported Chavez the most. So I guess that's a different perspective here. So let's see another one. Thank you.
We'll come back to you, obviously, later on. Now, next, don't go away. The next speaker is General Boris Saavedra, who is from Venezuela. Currently is Assistant Professor of National Security at the Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies and the EU. And you do have, as I said, the bio. Fundamentally, I think what is important to mention that he was a officer going all the way up the Venezuelan Air Force, and director of some of the schools and war colleges and so forth. So I think what is really important is to get a perspective from someone who knows also the military and the role of the military in Venezuela.
Good afternoon. Yeah. You know, we in the military, we cannot talk. We don't have PowerPoint. I'm a PowerPoint ranger. But I'd like to begin my remarks giving the thanks to Professor Alexander and also the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. But I'd like to begin saying that Chavez is a product of the political system that collapsed. He didn't win the election in that time because he was the best candidate of all over, and he proposed something real different. No, it's because the system collapsed, and the other options were more or less the same thing. And I'd like to say to you about myself something, because it's related to, you know, Venezuela, and it's related to give you something that you will not find in the books. Is that I'm coming from a very poor family, 7 brothers and sisters, but we live in the system that provides us opportunity, because my father was a shoemaker. He didn't have a lot of money, and he provided us, and I would say probably the state gave us the opportunity to all of us become professional. And I came to the armed forces that gave me the opportunity, not looking to my background, but the opportunity to come to the top, and I came. That political system gave me the opportunity to prepare myself, study here in the United States, and study in Europe, and be very prepared to perform my duties. And everything that the ambassador talked about the armed forces today, that's true. And this is very, very sad for me as a Venezuelan to admit that this is the situation today. I know in Latin America is a lot of inequality, yes. In Venezuela, still inequality, yes. But in the case of Venezuela, it was also opportunities. Is on? How you? Yes. Okay, thank you. And then I brought here this PowerPoint. I want to show you a lot of information, but I give you just few comments about each of them. And this is my objective, give you the context, because we need to look at Venezuela in the context of today, 21st century, in order to give you my perspective to the medium and long term. And this is the agenda. I will try to describe what is Chavismo, the Bolivarian Revolution, what is the domestic environment, what is the current situation today, the scenarios I see to the near future, and the foreign policy in Venezuela, because Venezuela has an impact in the region for several reasons mentioned by the ambassador, but I will mention also other reasons that I see. Then Cuba, Venezuela, and come some conclusions. Well, what I'm saying here is the characteristic of Chavismo is the authoritarian regime characterized by concentration of power in the ruler hand. A political system do more to loyalty to the ruler than to the identifiable ideology. It's a high polarized political arena that
block most institutional solution to the presidential crisis. Revolutionary passion and the third component of Chavismo, both a political project and final justification. The method of revolutionary confrontation is to deny the adversary any legitimate opposition to the regime and to consider him as a legitimate and thereby make him an enemy to be eliminated. And the strategic Bolivarian revolution, this is where I see the component: new democratic model, popular model, participatory and protagonist democracy. Participatory when you agree with the leader. If you disagree, it's no democracy. And democracy is disagreement. Democracy is confrontation, but it's not the case. State economy with the government control all means of production, political government control all local government with the centralization of power, creation of mission in order to replace the constitutional political institution, promoting the global anti-system movement opposing United States influence in the region. And here, what I see today is a domestic political environment characterized by vacuum power. It's a vacuum of power for these four major reasons: uncertainty to control political agenda. This is the way the government controls the political agenda. Ambiguity to maintain polarized society. President Chavez and this government is governing the country from the left, radical left. In any society, the leader governed from the left or right, automatic polarized society. Falsehood, Venezuelan government buried the truth before burying Chavez. That's the true reality. The ambassador say Chavez died on the 5th of March. I'm not so sure of that. I don't want to come here to a speculation, but I'm not so sure because the way how this Chavez situation has been handled. And complexity to the lack of management capacity of the government. Because the government has been characterized for so many years for the lack of sound management in government affairs. And this is a lot of things that you will see in my scenario, why I call the perfect storm today. Economic, political, and social crisis all together. And then I have in economics, you see, you can find this in the internet, the oil price in 1988 was $8. Today, and after Chavez came to power, plus more than $100. Oil production in 1992 was 3.2, and today is 2.7. In some sources, 2.7, 2.3. Nobody knows exactly because there's no transparency in government. National debt, it was $20 billion, and today is more than $150 billion today, Venezuelan debt. Oil export, 96% of every $100 came to the country. Venezuela physical expenditure has expanded in all dimensions compared what was before Chavez came to power. It's not just to the poor, all dimensions. Because the armament that Venezuela bought to Russia is a lot of money invest in that armament. I'm not so sure if Venezuela needs that armament. And I'm coming from the military. I'm not sure that we need that kind of armament. And it was an increase of 27% of expenditure just last year, about $5.8 billion. What is the consequences? It's a fiscal deficit about 1.2%, high inflation, contraction of the economy is expecting 3.6%, 5 currency devaluation, 2 currency devaluation in 100 days of Mr. Maduro in office, because he's not running for being in office. He's in office already 100 days, and 2 devaluation. The last one was yesterday. Currency exchange control, more than more than 10 years, an economy wholly addicted to the import goods and services. In the politics, very weak democratic institution, because you have the leader, and the leader control everything. You have the Minister of Education, but you have mission because you use parallel institution. Why? Because in this way you can avoid one thing important and basic in democracy: accountability, balance of power, control and oversight. It doesn't exist in Venezuela. And Venezuela has used in the last 10 years almost $1 trillion. It's a lot of money for a country with 26 million. Maduro plot accusation against Capriles. Easy to understand that. If the policy used by President Chavez for many years, those kind of accusation. Why? Because in the Marxist thought is, in order to achieve the end, it doesn't matter what means you use. And this is the mean they use just to maintain in the back of the mind of the Venezuelan that the major threat to Venezuela is the United States of America. That's the point. And that's the reason why Maduro is acting with the same agenda given by the G2, the Cuban G2. Same thing. Next. This is my scenario, because I agree Mr. Maduro is likely to be the next president. I hope not, but according to some polls and everything, he is going to be the next. Political instability, increasing lack of the government mismanagement, because he's going to have the same cabinet, very incapable to handle the government. Cuban influence, deep economic crisis, foreign policies focus in Latin America to unite the region, but against United States. It's not unite the region to get the region better. It's just to against United States. International investment, China, Russia, yes. But they need to see, they say, we hold all loans right now, we hold everything until you have your credibility and you have your legitimacy. And international investment, Venezuelan system, in that point, I think it's going to be very hard. Why? Because now with Chavez gone, Mr. Ahmadinejad is leaving in June. Let's see what happened in Iran. Because this is a major component of this agreement between these two countries. Because it's an agreement between two people with the same agenda, with the same kind of ideology, oppose the United States, and that's it. The other scenario that I see is Mr. Capriles. Policies and United Venezuela Society is the first one. Nuclear cabinet. Mr. Capriles is not alone. He was about 400 professionals in Venezuela working together in order to build up a program, government program. Legitimacy on international level, cut back international solidarity, money, regularization of U.S.-Venezuela relation, obviously, policy toward private and foreign direct investment, that's another issue important. And China and Russia, we need to review and revisit those agreements, because some of them we need to check under the Constitution if those agreements apply all this. And then you have the foreign policy with Mr. Maduro, continue the expansion of the Bolivarian revolution. I have also my concern because the context, the economic crisis in Venezuela, I don't think that Maduro will have the same money to throw money and use money in the way Mr. Chavez did it. Great impact in Venezuela foreign policy with the emerging split between ALBA and, the free trade of America. And the other aspect is in continue Venezuela-China partnership. Also, remember China is giving money to ALBA, but also to CELAC, continue Venezuelan Russian partnership. they have major concern because they say with this situation, they are risking now about $30 billion given to President Chavez. And what I want to show you very quickly, the two blocks, how the anti-system work. Up in those days, Chavez, now Maduro, and Ahmadinejad in the other side. What they are looking for, both anti-system war strategy to what? To the multipolar war. What they use? Both. They use oil, they use anti-US rhetoric, they use arms buying. Also in the Middle East, they cite to the Arabs, very clear. Also Chinese support, Russian support, and they use the media. They are very good at using the media and trying to tell the people something that is normally not true. And there's a lot of corruption in that system, basically, because it's no accountability, it's no balance of power. That's very clear. This is what they were looking to do. In my opinion, that system now is in a hole because Chavez gone, Ahmadinejad is leaving power. We need to see what happened in Iran. Cuba-Venezuela relation, oil, 10,000 billion of dollars a year, plus more than 100,000 barrels of oil. Havana provide, quotation mark, health professionals. I have my concern about that. 8,000 political security advisors. Driven just for common ideology and Cuban economic interest. Cuba, Venezuela, I think the most important point I want to make here is that Cuba is using Venezuela resources as the major instrument to blackmail countries using Venezuela resources. About 17 countries receive benefit from Venezuela. About 17. That's my conclusions. The point here is Maduro don't have the same facility, economic, political, that Chavez had to project his foreign policy. And this is a major challenge for Mr. Maduro. The other conclusion I want to make is a strong resentment against Chavez in the armed forces for the Cuban military meddling in Venezuelan armed forces. I agree. We need to look that it's going to have a Chavismo after Chavez probably in the political arena, but inside the armed forces, I doubt. Military intervention is likely if the Supreme Court constitutional decisions are not respected. Cuban intervention in the armed forces is more difficult with Maduro because Maduro needs to consolidate his leadership inside the armed forces. The number 3 conclusion is the new president needs to put together the best professional team of experts in economy, planning, and strategy to overcome this crisis. I don't think that Mr. Maduro has the leadership and his ideology prevent him to do that. And the best minds are in the other side of the equation, the political equation in Venezuela. I call, in my conclusion, if we're talking about, we are concerned here with the Sequestration Act, it's a real sequestration in Venezuela with the economy and political and social situation. And let's see how Mr. Maduro handled that. I will stop here just for, thank you.
Thank you very much, General, for your insights from the ground up. And we are going to come back to some of the points you made. Another perspective from Venezuela, I'm going to call the next speaker, Gerber Torres, who was the Minister of Privatization in Venezuela, and as many of you know, is one of the leading experts in this particular field, also working with many international organizations like the World Bank, the International Development Bank, the IMF, and so forth. And he will give us another insight into what's happening in the post-Chavez era.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the Potomac Institute and to you, Alexander, for this opportunity to talk about Venezuela and the post-Chavez era. I will follow more or less the title of the panel. The question was Latin America post-Chavez, Vadis, where is it going? And I want to start with an optimistic note, saying that Latin America is doing pretty well, was doing very well while Chavez was alive, and will do better without Chavez. Latin America, the last 5 years has been the best 5 years of the last 50 years, talking in general, overall, for the region. Not only in terms of general macroeconomic indicators that everybody follows, like GDP growth or rate of inflation or unemployment. All those numbers are pretty good for Latin America, but also in terms of structural reforms, the social agenda. There is, for example, one very important indicator of the profound transformation that Latin America has gone through, positive transformation, like, for example, that in the last 10 years, the middle class has increased 50% in Latin America. So it's not only that we are doing well by traditional macroeconomic indicators, is that poverty has been considerably reduced, middle class has considerably grown, and income inequality has been reduced. Latin America is the only region in the world that has seen income inequality reduced in the last 5 years, which is surprising because, well, Latin America has been well known, and some of the countries in Latin America, like Brazil, has been well known for extreme inequality. But this is a problem that is being addressed in Latin America, I would say, pretty successfully. So Latin America was doing well, and before Chavez, and we will do better without Chavez, as I said before, because certainly Chavez was a threat to the nation, to the region. Chavez was a threat to everything that, you know, I guess, and I'm sure most people here will believe on, to democracy, to rule of law, to governance, to freedom, to accountability, institutions, whatever good thing is there, I would say probably he was a threat to it. But Chavez, even before he died, his influence was fading, was declining. And we have several indications of it. Of course, there are some very strong factors like the ones Ambassador Noriega mentioned, and those have to be taken into account very seriously. But when you talk about politics in general, influence, ideological influence, then you find that, for example, I'm working with Gallup organization right now, and we measure, you know, the popularity of different leaders in Latin America. You see how Chavez, who was at the very high point in, you know, early part of his presidency, he was coming down in the last, was coming down in the last few years considerably, and he was below Obama, for example, who was not as he speak in the last 2 years. So his influence was declining for different reasons that I'm going to mention. But he did he did have an impact at the beginning, and he was, at some point, he was, I would say, a considerable threat. He used the money he had to support governments in the region that would be, aligned with his agenda, and political groups. And at one point, there were two episodes in Latin America that were very close to happen, and that could have derailed the region or other countries in the region. And those two episodes, I want to remind you of them, was one when Humala ran the first time to be president of Peru. If he had won, I'm pretty sure that he would have done a completely different type of government that he did when he won the second time he attempted. The first time he attempted, and it's been said, and I completely believe that he got a lot of support from Chavez in cash. He used to go a lot to Caracas when he was a candidate the first time. The advantage or the lack Peruvian had, they were lucky because when the first time he ran, he got a very radical agenda. It was a time when Venezuela was doing well, relatively well. Chavez was at the peak of his popularity. He lost by a small percentage. The second time he ran, he could see that first Venezuela was a mess already, and that Brazil was doing very well. So his reference moved from Venezuela to Brazil, and he took Lula as his reference. So Peruvians were lucky that Obama won not the first time but the second time, and he's been so far a great president. And the second episode that was about to be, I would say, a tragedy was in Mexico with López Obrador, who almost won the election in Mexico, you may remember, and also had a very type of Chavez agenda. And Mexico is doing so well now, impressively well, to the extent that, to give you an example of how things have changed in Latin America, we, again with Gallup, in the entire region and around the world, we ask people, if you had the means to leave this country, to move out of this country, would you do it? And Mexico has reached the lowest point ever. Right now, it's exactly the same number of Americans who would leave America if they could, or if they can. So 11% is a very low point compared to previous numbers. So Mexicans want to stay in Mexico. Actually, there are more Mexicans returning from here to Mexico, which, by the way, in part will help to move ahead with the migration reform. So Chavez had an impact, as I said, in the region. I may go more in detail in a few minutes on that, but was declining already by the time he died, and it will, I hope, and I think it will effectively be less of what it was or it is today. Now, the question is, why he had such an impact? What made Chavez, be a leader with the type of impact he had in Latin America? I will say that there are at least three factors. The first one is the persona, he himself. He was an extraordinary leader. Chavez was a type of person that is born, every 50 or every 100 years. Exceptional leader, with a, absolutely hungry of power, to the point of being sick. Some people think that he didn't die of cancer, but of hunger for power. With a vision, and I want to emphasize this, a vision for the entire region, a vision that I don't share. I bet more of you don't share, but a vision, a long-term vision, a desire to change the world, and not only his country, but the world. And that he's completely different from other regional leaders. You see, you go around the region, one of the advantages Chavez had is that none of them was much interested on things beyond the borders. Calderón, if it was Calderón, or Peña Nieto, is Mexico, even Brazil. Lula, basically Brazil, Dilma, Brazil, all of them. They focus on their own countries. Little concern, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this, little concern about a long-term vision for the region. This is something we've been lacking. This is something democratic forces lack. This is one of our liabilities, I should say, which is the lack of an alternative vision to that has been put forth by those type of leaders that we are facing or confronting, Chavez, Fidel Castro, and so on. So, it's a leader, very charismatic, with this long-term vision, very much aware of the importance of subjective well-being, very much aware that economic performance is not all, that economic growth is not all, that infrastructure and material things around you is not all. He played with it. And I had this, it's a personal experience that working with Gallup, I've been working on a project where we study well-being, track and study subjective well-being around the world. And sometimes you see countries where the economic performance is good, but subjective well-being, how people feel, is going down. So, for example, we have some graph for Egypt and Tunis, where you see, previous to the Arab, spring, where you see those countries, economic indicators going up, but bad subjective well-being going down. For Egypt, for example, it's impressive. You see, that country was growing at about 6% per year the last few years. Relatively low inflation. The same in Tunis. But subjective well-being, how people felt for different reasons about their life, their country, their institution, was going down. So Chavez was a leader very aware of that, and based on that, he was capable of establishing a special emotional connection with a large part of the population, which again is something that most democratic leaders fail to do. Unfortunately, we Democrats are too focused on economic traditional variables. So when you talk to any leader in Latin America, for example, this is something I have done with this data about the importance of subjective well-being. Basically, they would refer to and be concerned about, again, growth, employment, traditional economic data. So Chavez was a leader very much focused on that. And this is why you can see a country that is doing very poorly economically, but still people can go and support him and vote for him. There is some type of growth that you can call unhappy growth. And there is some type of recession that you can call happy recession and happy collapse. If you see the data, for example, and now, again, because we are talking about Latin America, if you see the data of Venezuela and Chile, and you don't know the economic performance of those two countries, and you just look at the data in terms of, well-being, how people feel, you could think that the data
from Venezuela belongs to Chile, and vice versa. Just as an example. So that's an element. The leader, the vision, the capacity to connect, to understand those dimensions. Of course, the resources he counted on. Huge resources. The longest period of very high oil prices. That is not only the amount he counted on, more than $1 trillion, about $1.4 trillion in 14 years, which is for any Latin American country and for the government is a huge amount, is that he could use it. He could use it, he did use it without any restraint, any constraint at all. He didn't have institutional constraint. He didn't have any type of political constraint. He didn't have religious constraint, no constraint. In that sense, he could have been one of the most powerful men on earth, because presidents of bigger countries, richer countries, had more constraints, institutional constraints that he didn't have at all. So he could use it, as his absolute discretion. And of course, they were very creative. I would argue that Chavez has to be studied because they were able to introduce new ways of undermining democracy using democratic means. They were very smart at that. It was not a common dictatorship. It was not Cuba, where they didn't care about forms or formalities. They were very careful to show a facade to the world of institutions of different types that were working, etc. They were so creative and they were so good at that, they were able to export it. They exported a recipe, an agenda that other countries followed and did very well. Correa in Ecuador, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. They called for a constitutional convention to write the new constitutions, and the steps were there, very clear. Called for dividing society, calling a world class against the rich, etc., etc. They did it very well, systematically, and so that was something that they did very well. So those three elements, I think, were there. His character, his exceptionality, the resources he counted on, and political creativity. In terms of impacts, Ambassador Noriega mentioned some of them. And of course, there is a group of countries where you see the major impact he had, which are the ones we all know: Cuba, Colombia with the guerrillas, Nicaragua, some Caribbean island. But the biggest impact that Chavez had, and is the one obstacle that he created, or problem he created in the region, and that is going to be removed now that he's gone, is that he kind of blockade the possibility of the region to come together faster and to be a huge common trade zone. So if it was not for Chavez, I think UNASUR, for example, would be, instead of just a political kind of area or political tool, would be an economic tool for real integration. And this is what I see happening after Chavez is gone, or now that Chavez is gone, that some initiatives that the region has taken and that were meant to go farther for economic integration now can move ahead easier, faster. You see, when you see the region, you see a group of countries, particularly those overlooking the Pacific, like Chile, Peru, Colombia, Panama, Mexico, that are coming closer and closer and that are moving forward to create or be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that would bring also countries from Asia to huge free trade zone that will be the biggest of the world. I think that those countries now, without Chavez, can bring the rest of the region and can have even countries like Brazil, Uruguay, etc., moving faster in that direction. This is the most positive development I see with Chavez gone. The possibility of the region coming closer, coming together, and taking advantage of this huge opportunity that is there for us in the world. When the world is trying to, the European Union trying to come up with a free trade agreement here with the United States, when Japan has a new leadership, etc., etc. Finally, I want just to refer to one issue that has been raised here, which is the possibility of Chavismo to survive without Chavez. And I think that to the extent of what Chavez meant for the region, no, it won't survive. If it is just to be something like Peronismo in Argentina, you know, a very vague idea, concept, something that is there, it will be there. But as a real movement, organized movement that has impact, real impact in the region and in the country, I think they won't be able to survive it because some of the conditions I mentioned before are not there anymore. The resources are not there anymore, as has been clearly explained here. The leader is not here anymore. And of course, the region fortunately has been able to continue to move forward and become stronger. And to the extent that it has become much stronger, it will be less vulnerable to that type of effect or impact from other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister Torres, for your broad overview. And obviously you raised many questions that hopefully we can come back to. Our last panelist is Dr. Fernando Jimenez, and he is currently in the private practice, but formerly was the legal advisor to the Inter-American Development Bank and the Inter-American Investment Council. And when I met him 100 years ago, not exactly, we were dealing with the question of ETA in the Basque country. He was the governor of the Basque country. And I thought that it would be useful for the panel to have a view from the outside in terms of the development. He dealt with many of the countries for many years.
Thank you, Yona, and thank you, the Potomac Institute, for giving me the honor to be part of this discussion. Actually, we had, talking about ETA, we had a little problem with Chavez about ETA in that time, but fortunately, after so many discussions and negotiations, everything was solved, all the extraditions and delivery of the terrorists that they were taking refuge in Venezuela. I think that the future of Venezuela without Chavez is uncertain. And it is uncertain because despite the exaltation regarding the regime political continuity through Maduro and the mass movement he fosters, there is obvious internal political tension. We still do not know One, if Chavez died in Cuba or in Venezuela. Two, if the Venezuelan army, which supposedly must maintain public security and political neutrality, agrees to overtly accept anti-constitutional actions, both now as well as in the future. We see as real concern the recent statements made by the Minister of Defense appointed by the dead president. As you know, maybe, he asked the people to go to the polls and to vote democratically, but of course, provided that they are going to vote for Chavez's successor. That's the real democracy the top of the army pretends. We know that this statement doesn't reflect the opinion of all military body. Chavez knew how to deal with his colleagues in the army. He kept unified the military in the political field, in the economic welfare, and of course in the barracks discipline. We assume that Maduro has not the same capability. 3. If its policy of generosity towards Cuba and smaller Caribbean sovereign countries will continue along the same terms of a lack of budgetary control and political colonialism as it has done up to now. 4. If it is true what Jerry Weir, Director of Criminal Justice International Associates, has stated by saying that Hugo Chávez's fortunes is worth $2 billion and that groups of Bolivian criminals linked to Chávez's governments had depleted around $100 billion. I've been in Bolivia 2 weeks ago, and I can tell you that there is I'm not sure about the complete link, but there is a link about that. The upcoming elections, which Nicolás Maduro, the theoretical heir to Chávez, has already practically won, will reflect the votes of a mass of population which was elevated from living in misery to a lower middle class status, and which represents his best political customer base. It is a fact that when Chávez rose to power, he found 75% of Venezuelans living on the threshold of poverty. It is also true that we must admit, whether we like it or not, that as Chávez would say, he was not the root of the cause, rather that his government had to face its consequences. Chávez won the successive elections, and Chávez also won fair and square the referendum to modify the constitution. However, these realities, which would enable us to recognize the figure of a charismatic and democratic leader capable of facing great domestic and foreign challenges, defending his people, have regrettably been overshadowed by the most typical flaws and foibles of historical despots. He attempted to foster integration, but absolutely failed to reach any kind of unity in the hemisphere. He tried to distribute income, but left the country and the economy in very bad shape, and not because the price of an oil barrel is low, rather because Venezuela is not competitive at all. He lost the trust of society and serious countries in the international community. On a domestic level, currently in Venezuela, you are either a friend or a foe of the regime. In Bolivia, a Venezuelan who has he's in the Bolivian environment, he said, "Well, you must accept that you must accept us, or you are friend or a foe." I said, "No, I never believe in good governments or bad governments. I believe in effective governments or not effective governments, and your government has not proved that it's effective." Sometimes, when we see the full picture, we are highly concerned about the Venezuelan-Iran relations, the Venezuela-China relations, the Russian influences, or how the Cubans play their game in the country. Of course, this is geopolitically is very important. But I believe that what is truly important is to be able to explain to the world that our regime is not a democratic one just because of the votes it attains. Rather, it is so if it is capable of ruling in a democratic fashion. It is inconceivable that we accept a government which shuts down any media outlet which is hostile to it, which coerces journalists and monitors people's lives and homes, following a pattern based on Maoist or Marxist-Leninist principles. We should expect Maduro to continue to place his South American fellow colleagues, to continue to use two different languages in his relations with the United States, to subtly review and restate the generous donations to Cuba, $5 billion in oil, cash and services, and the Caribbean Basin countries. And he will move along lines of friendships and cooperation with Iran while avoiding friction with the United States caused by these actions. I understand that the international community in regard to this new scenario must 1. Carefully observe the electoral process. 2. Convey messages of collaboration and understanding to the government which will be legally constituted. 3. Warn this government about the consequences of erratic policies in approaching countries which derange international security. This is not about meddling in domestic affairs, rather demanding that normal relations must be based on a reciprocal understanding regarding the international order established by UN mandates. 4. Standardized criteria so that if, despite efforts made, both Venezuela or any other country pretending to derange the aforementioned international legal order, both regarding foreign investment, rule of law, as well as financing against terrorism, drug trafficking and money laundering, will have an immediate and united response by respectful countries against this deranged legal order. I am referring to the fact that it should be required the European Union as well as the United States, in addition to friendly and allied nations, should impose sanctions against those who conduct arbitrary and illegitimate actions affecting their interests and the rule of law that we must protect. Talking about Spain and the United States, that we have a lot of interest there, I would say that we have common interest in protecting our relations, our trade, and our investments in Venezuela. The broad picture is that we are important players in this part of the world. That is why, although we don't know the results of the April 14 election, we must see carefully the legitimacy of these results and the immediate consequences that without that will open a political transition in the country. We are going to confront problems, challenges and provocations, but I am optimistic that the future and the path towards a real democracy are closer now than when Chavez was alive. Then another question that we must think over carefully. In order to facilitate the future transition from Chavism, not now in these elections, but thinking about the future ones, are we promote some kind of reconciliation in the country? Are we facilitate the transition to democracy, to a real democracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before we turn to the audience for your comments, questions, I would like to turn to the panel and to see whether they would like to make some comments now on the comments or presentation of the other members of the panel. Okay, so why don't we begin? Please identify yourself for the record and ask a question. Don't deliver a speech.
Thank you. My name is Richard Dawson, Dawson Associates International Inc. I want to congratulate all the panel for really all the great information and analysis they have provided to all of us. And my first question will be to Roger. What do you think is the impact in all these measures that major oil companies like Chevron, Texaco, operating in Venezuela, and the lobby they had supporting Chavez for the last years? And my second question is for you also, and what is the relation of the South Command to the Venezuelan militaries? Apparently, according to the South Command heads of the last years, the relation with the Venezuelan militaries have been always very good. there never had any problems with the Venezuelan militaries. My question to Vadis, dear friends, is do you think that the agreement you mentioned between Iran and Venezuela, personified by Chavez and Nepal, that both disappeared from the region, now is going to continue supporting Venezuela, the FARC, and Iran, Hezbollah? Do you think that is going to continue for longer, or do you think that it's going to stop as a consequence? And to Herbert, you say, Herbert, when you say Chavez was exceptional leader, you mean a negative leader or a positive leader, or more a sort of a provocateur agent in the Western Hemisphere? Those are my questions.
I'll go first. Does this microphone work? I'll go first, and I'll go fairly quickly. I remember having a conversation with a Brazilian diplomat, and I said, well, the thing that makes Chavez so impactful in the region is that he has all that money. Obviously, at $1.1 trillion, and while he was president, that he can spend virtually any way he chose. And the Brazilian responded, does he have all that money? Actually, you have the money, you give him that money, which is an interesting point because of the fact that the United States imported so much oil. We, when he took power, imported about 2.7 million, maybe, barrels a day, and maybe a little less than that, perhaps. But it was under 900,000 barrels a day recently, and going downward. But still, it is fact that so much of what Chavez was able to accomplish was because of the U.S. addiction to Venezuelan oil, which we are weaning ourselves off of, but which was impactful. The fact is, I reminded my staff when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs that we do not import oil from Venezuela. We import oil from U.S. companies in Venezuela. And so we had to be very, very careful exactly what we did to impact the ability of those companies to operate in that country. The fact is, Chevron Texaco, with all due respect, is the biggest lobbyist for the Chavez regime in this country. And they recently signed an agreement to put another $2 billion. So they're willing to go in there, as they do, when the Chinese are not prepared to go in. It's because they have their special deals with the Chavez government. I do not buy gasoline from Chevron or Citgo, for that matter. In terms of the relationship with Southern Command, look, their position is as one of the generals, 4-star, actually it was an admiral said, you can figure out who it is, I don't want any trouble with Hugo. And that's been their position. The problem is Hugo wants trouble with us, and he served up that trouble whether we liked it or not. And I don't think the Southern Command has demonstrated any sort of leadership on the subject, or for that matter, under the last sync, even curiosity about that.
I think we need to realize that the relation between Iran and Venezuela has been there for many years. If we look back to history, back in the 60s, when the OPEC was created, Iran and Venezuela as the founders countries of that organization. And the relation between the two countries until Chavez came to power was a relation related to OPEC members. And we have a good relation, same relation that we have with Saudi Arabia or other OPEC country. What happened is, when Chavez regime came, it was an ideological agenda. And that made a big difference. When these two leaders get together in Saudi Arabia in a meeting and start talking, and they sympathize each other. And from that moment on, in 2005, they start talking and talking. And then when we had this summit, OPEC summit in Caracas, they come closer and realize that they have a lot of common ideas, political ideas, they can come forward in that. Also, we need to realize that back in 1980, 82, we have one of the Chavez advisor today. He was my classmate in the Air Force Academy. Then he went to Libya and also to Iran in that time, because it's a relation that is hard to explain, but I have my theory about that, is why the military and the left have been together in Venezuela. But this is another issue. But that kind of thing come up, and that one of the advisors of President Chavez say this is the moment that Iran, Libya, another country get together, but what is the point? Against United States. It's not because the Venezuela interest, when Chavez said we are brothers from Iran. Brothers? What do you mean brothers? But you know, he talked, he said, I always say that Chavez had the ability to sell ice to a penguin, and the penguin will buy it, okay? He said, and he was so lucky because look at the context of the oil market when he came to power and when he was president. And he chose to die in a good moment, because today, with the crisis in Venezuela, even Chavez had to make strong decisions, even with his charisma and everything, because the situation is quite different. And going back, Venezuela and Iran, well, Mr. Maduro need to consolidate leadership in the PSUV inside, in the country, but specifically in the armed forces. The armed forces is not Chavez former military, no. Mr. Maduro is a politician that they don't know, and that Cuban influence, they disagree, because inside the military is very different factions. It's not united, a different faction. You see the Minister of Defense saying those stupid things, middling politics, but what do you think the people think about this Minister of Defense? In order to get Hezbollah and Iran middling in Venezuela, you need to have Chavez. With Maduro, I doubt. But let's see what happens.
Regarding my qualification of Chavez as exceptional leader, I recognize that exceptional, the word exceptional, have kind of positive connotation, but exceptional just means out of the ordinary. So when he says that Chavez, is capable of selling ice to a penguin, that's something that is you need to be exceptional to do that. Chavez did terrible things, but he was exceptional. I would mention as exceptional leaders also, Stalin and guy who did. Yeah, I mean, they were capable of doing. They did terrible things, but they were not ordinary men. That's what I mean. They were not ordinary people. To give you an example of Chavez's capabilities, when I remember in Venezuela before, I was in government when Chavez made his first attempt, coup d'etat. But I remember that we used to think of Venezuela as a country where it was very, very difficult to change anything. With, that's impossible. And one of the things that Chavez taught us is that everything is possible to change. I mean, he changed even the name of the country. Instead of, he unthinkable. All bad things, very bad, but difficult to have imagined that someone, would have been capable of doing them. So in that sense, it's extraordinary, out of the ordinary. Mostly, or I would say maybe 100% bad things for the country, but not something that an ordinary person can do.
Okay, please stand stand up and...
Yeah, I'm Ira Strauss. I'm author of an article on unipolarity. And I was very interested in General Saavedra's remark that the vision of Chavez beyond the national and even beyond the regional was to build the multipolar world by working with other regimes. You'll find that here in the United States there's very little support for unipolarity. I think that's tragic, but that's the reality. And in Europe, which is sort of the co-holder of unipolarity with the United States, you'll also find practically no one supporting unipolarity. Is there anyone in the opposition who supports unipolarity or has a coherent conception? And if it's not that word, what is the basis of opposition? I give an alternative. For example, there's Professor Carlos Escudé of Argentina, who developed the theory of peripheral realism, which is that instead of fighting against the core countries' leadership of the world, the weaker regions of the world and poorer regions should make themselves attractive for investment and improve themselves and opt out of the global power struggles. Is that the perspective, a perspective that has any appeal, or is Mr. Torres correct that there's just no popular appeal that can be had in terms of a global vision for a liberal or moderate or conservative opposition?
I'd like to begin saying that I agree with Mr. Torres when he said the exceptionalism of Mr. Chavez and the vision, because he is the only leader in those days that have an world agenda and regional agenda. I don't see now inside Venezuela or in the region other leader that is thinking in that way. This is the exceptionalism, and I share with that, agree with that way to describe what is the difference in President Chavez. He had a war agenda, and you remember back about 4 years ago when Venezuela was one of the select countries to came to the Security Council at the United Nations. Venezuela has been in the Security Council about 3 or 4 times. But the moment that Venezuela was one of the countries to go into the United Nations Security Council for 2 years, President Chavez went all over the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, for about 22 days, traveling, offering everything. At the end, Venezuela was competing with what? Guatemala and Panama. And Guatemala won. Why? Because Mr. Chavez tried to buy people with money. But again, this is one of the leaders that he got the vision, and that's the reason why he agreed with Ahmadinejad with that vision to the multipolar world. Because Venezuela, in the mind of Chavez, was supposed to be a regional leader, a regional power. But in order to do that, need to confront United States of America. He didn't think another way around, just to confront United States, and then they can develop a different world, multipolar world, and Venezuela become a regional power, without taking in consideration Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, because all those leaders were so concerned how to run the country. But Chavez said, no, I can control the country, I control all powers, I got money, that's it. And that's the reason, that's my best answer to your question.
I would say that multipolarism was a way for Chavez to sell his international agenda. He was basically anti-American. And what he would have loved is to see America destroyed. And he wanted to bring down capitalism. He wanted to bring down the United States of America. He would join forces with whoever would be trying to do the same. And this is why you saw Chavez in the most strange alliances. Saddam Hussein, I remember him going to visit Saddam Hussein when it was prohibited by the United Nations to visit him. Anywhere he could go. Of course, they had to present it in a way that didn't sound that radical or that awful. They would say it's not the people of the United States, it is the government, it is capitalism that we need to bring down because capitalism has caused so much damage. And in the middle of it, they would say crazy things like Mars. I don't know if you know that, but at one point they said that there had been life in Mars and probably capitalism had destroyed it.
No, the International Monetary Fund.
And then, so I think strategically, the way to sell your position is to say we are for a multipolar world, so that we want different actors and not just the United States. But the basic aim was against the United States. Now, there is something very interesting here. Why he came to that position is Chavez evolved. He at the beginning he was not. He didn't present himself as socialist or anti-capitalist. My theory is that the only thing he cared about was power. And he wanted to stay in power forever. Now, he needed a reason to be in power forever. If you come to power and you say that what you want to do is relatively simple, then why are you going to stay here forever? You have to say, we need to transform this society in a very deep, profound manner. We have to change this society and be a socialist society, and this takes decades. So, therefore, I need to be here for very long. So this is the reason I think that he moved from a position at the beginning of his term when he was very much in favor of the third wave, Tony Blair, that type of position. He progressively moved to a more radical position for socialism, and then they talk about socialism of the 21st century. That was the big name, they used it. With the big problem they have now that socialism of the 21st century, first, they don't have any theory behind it. There is no theory. And second, they now don't have leader. So without theory and without leader, this is why I think they are lost. And with all those economic and serious problems in front of them. But they move then from that initial position, the third way, to radicalism, anti-capitalism, and then it was anti-Americanism. By the way, very hypocritical, because at the same time they enjoy, all the luxuries of the first world. Their cars, their gadgets, their planes, everything. So, had a rhetorical component too.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the clock and it is ticking, I think. We covered almost every aspect except we didn't talk about the Pope. And in terms of his leadership and spiritual, you have a last question? Milton, please.
No, Senator I recall that Chavez seemed to be a very religious person. He's the only person I remember who, speaking for the UN General Assembly, started his speech by crossing himself. So I'm wondering, what is the role of the church in Chavismo?
Well, let me just say a couple things on that score and then some of the other issues that were addressed. And these are the folks that can tell you about the church in Venezuela. But Chavez was crossing himself as a farce because he was talking about George Bush having been there, and he said he smelled sulfur there, and he was sort of exercising the UN podium, which would take a lot more than Chavez to do, and a lot more than the Holy Father to do, for that matter. But it was a farce, and I'm absolutely convinced he found religion at the end, and it was very sincere. But that's what a lot of us do. Some of us don't wait till the end. But he was making a joke, and I think that's Chavez. I would wonder what he would have amounted to if oil stayed at $11 a barrel, as opposed to 10 times that. And the other thing that sort of blunted Chavismo, and very brilliant presentations here about the different close calls with Humala and López Obrador, was Lula, a man of the certainly labor movements, man of the left, but a genuine Democrat who came along just at a time when this neo-populism was taking off, and he vindicated capitalism. because he demonstrated that you can be committed to social justice through effective means that are being copied in other countries and hailed even by people on the right as something that governments legitimately need to do to empower people in material ways. He did that without closing a single newspaper, without shattering the democratic institutions of the country, without concentrating all the power in the presidency, without co-opting the courts and the electoral authorities. And he was elected president on his third try. He was a genuine Democrat. And so he was someone, people can immediately look and say, I don't have to turn my government over to a person like Chavez when I have Michelle Bachelet or Lula da Silva to choose from. And that goes to the essential point, which was echoed here by the Venezuelans, and with all due respect, I say that the political class in the country, for the fact that for decades they were themselves corrupt, nothing on the intergalactic scale of Hugo Chavez, but there was enough corruption there and a lot of oil wealth that was not going to benefit the poor majority in the country. And so that's how Chavez came about. But, I think people realize now that they did not have to go down that road. And I think, quite frankly, if the opposition is intelligent, and they're going to have to be very clever and intelligent and agile in the years ahead, post the election, they can begin to capture some of those political orphans who were committed to Chavismo because of the material benefits that he produced, but convince them again that democratic institutions can work for them, and you can have pluralism and you can have reconciliation. You don't have to have polarization and division that serves the interest of people trying to hold on to power.
Monica, you want to make a comment?
No, just
Lola?
remind that Lula tried 4 times before getting, the interesting thing is that Lula himself calls Venezuela a very democratic state, and Chavez very democratic leader. So, he plays on both sides.
He's a very good politician.
Yeah, it is.
And Odebrecht endorses Maduro now. They make a lot of money on Venezuela, and it's great doing business with corrupt governments. You don't have to worry about bidding processes, and so God bless them.
Yeah. But I think we need to look also that clientelism in Venezuela has been there forever. You look at other presidents before Chavez, they've been using clientelism. The difference with Chavez is using the clientelism 100% the time. He was not ruling the country. He was always in the political campaign. I don't remember to see President Chavez in office at least 3 or 4 days, working hard in order to build up a good policies or doing something really managing the country. No, he was always in the route, also outside, giving public speeches. And I always ask, when this guy is working? I don't know, but this is President Chavez. Talking about the religion, well, 92% of Venezuelans are Catholic. But that depends with intensity. And I agree with the ambassador. President Chavez, when he realized he had cancer, he started thinking about, yes, God exists. Before that, God was himself. That's it. And he felt himself the pain of a real illness, because he has a lot of people in jail in Venezuela suffering cancer, and they are still in jail. Remember the judge, the lady, it was in the press, and she's still in jail, and she had cancer. And when they say, why you don't have some special consideration? First of all, she was in jail because she was accomplished his work in very honest way, independent. And she was through by Chavez inside the jail. But he never thought about that. And, you know, when he realized he had cancer, even though in that situation, never thought to release that lady from the jail. And then I think, yes, he was Catholic. But what kind of Catholic is it? President Chavez? He played a lot of manipulation. With the cross and the sign over there, it's just rhetoric. I always says that if President Chavez was alive, living in office, he could go to Hollywood and have a job very easy. Because good entertainer, for me, President Chavez is an excellent entertainer. But the real leader, political leader, very effective in government, my position, never, ever.
Just a very short comment on religiosity. When he started his government, he was attacking permanently church, and you know, he said terrible things about the church and individuals. But as he got sick, as he's been said, he started changing his attitude, and even some of his main slogans. One of his main slogans was country land, socialism, or debts. And then when he became sick, they removed debts, and it became homeland, socialism, or we'll live forever. So.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a concern.
Just you had your chance as a press. No. We'll have other opportunities, as you know. In fact, as I mentioned, we'll discuss in some detail the link, with Iran and with Hezbollah on the 4th of April. We covered a great deal of territory. This is just the beginning, as I always say, the beginning rather than the end of discussion. I'm going to call on my colleague, Professor Don Wallace, who is the chairman of the International Law Institute and professor of law at Georgetown Law School, to make some final remarks.
1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. You can talk as long as you want, but finish in 3 minutes.
I usually say very nice things about Yonah, but not today. We don't have the time. Fernando Jimenez really summarized, I thought, extremely well everything this really excellent panel said. He did not mention the Pope, it's true. I'm not going to say anything about Venezuela because both the General and the Ambassador have told us really a great deal. Let me remind you of the topic. It's Quo Vadis Latin America, and I would even say Quo Vadis world. I mean, that's really what's lurking behind. And I thought that Senor Torres really, and the professor, said two things which we might have spent more time on. UNASUR, which is sort of an economic union, would be, why is that an appeal in Latin America? There always has been for integration. And Senor Torres said there's something more than just the economics. You know, we're not just economic men. I think that's one of the great failings of we in North America. We focus much too much on the economy, maybe even on the Marine Corps. And I wonder what Latins think about that. And the other thing is the point that Professor Arruda made, which is there clearly has been this popular appeal in Latin America for years, populist appeal. I mean, look at the unhappy situation in Argentina for the last, 80 years. I think we should think about that. And that'll be, I guess, my next to last point. All too often in Washington, we think about Washington. I think about me, we think about Washington. I think Americans have to disenthrall themselves, to use a Lincolnesque word. We really must think about the world to some extent the way the world thinks about itself, and of course how they think about us. There's no question that just as we are obsessed with ourselves, unfortunately as Chavez becomes obsessed with us, or I cannot pronounce Madanajar's full name in Iran. I think one final thing I would say is this. The world is changing profoundly. Very little was said about China. I think America wants to think about what our own self-regard in the light of a very changing world. And within that changing world, we in America, who I think have probably neglected Latin America, at the same time, that's very American. I think it's the Latins who shouldn't neglect themselves. So I wish in a way there'd been a little bit more about Latin America
in the gross, and not just Hugo Chavez, who, whatever his oil wealth and his exceptional personality, is gone. Although he's embalmed, I'm told, like Lenin in Caracas. But so, anyway, I thought it was a wonderful program, Yona, and I'm glad I didn't have much chance to really talk about you. Wasn't given the time, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're adjourned, right?
Thank you. I really